Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event. It's sort of global kickoff to our local Twin Cities Book Festival. We're so thrilled to be featuring Anne Enright in conversation with Francine Prose. I'm Eric Lorber, the director of Rain Taxi, and if you don't yet know about us, we are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature. Our work revolves around a quarterly magazine of critical writing. I'm holding here our brand new fall issue, hot off the press. Check out our website after the event to see if you might want to become a Rain Taxi member and receive a year's worth of print issues in the mail. We're privileged to receive grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, but our most vital support comes from individual readers like you. So if you're able to make a donation, we'll put a little info on how to do that in today's chat column, where we can see a lot of people are already chiming in, sharing comments and their enthusiasm. Thank you for that. Don't forget there are other ways to participate on your screen as well. If you have a question for the authors, put that in the question box at any time. We're going to get to those toward the end of the event. And of course, the best button on the screen, buy the book. And in this case, you can purchase the new release soon out in the US here, the Wren by Anne Enright, as well as other books by Anne and by Francine Prose. All of those available from our partner bookseller, Majors and Quinn, a great independent right here in Minneapolis. I can't speak highly enough of this new book and its author, Anne Enright, who has become an essential novelist of the new millennium. Truly one of the greats in the English language at the moment, and so thrilled to have one of our own American greats, Francine Prose, to lead our conversation today. It's my great pleasure to have them both here. Put your hands together at home if you're so inclined, and please welcome Anne Enright and Francine Prose.
Hi, Anne.
Hi, Francine. How are you?
I'm fine. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I just want to begin by saying how much I love the book. I just admired it so much. And just, I had COVID when I was reading it. So your book was really a pleasure. I mean, I want to say that it put me out of my misery, but that has a kind of euthanasia connotation. So it distracted me from my misery.
Good.
So I was very, very grateful. So given that the book hasn't come out here in the States yet, do you want to give a very brief, reductive idea of what happens in the book, or what? I could do it if you don't want to, but...
Well, it's an Irish book, okay? And it's got an Irish poet in it, and the poet is dead, okay? The poet is called Phil McTara. He's dead, but his poems are still in the book and on the page, and an account of his childhood. But the book really centers on his daughter, Carmel, who he left when she was 12 years of age to lead his poetical life, and her daughter, Nell, who is, I suppose, I'm not sure if the word is millennial. She's about 23 when in the book, and she's leading a poetical life of her own. So it's just these three characters. Very hard to. I haven't. You know, you write a book and it is itself, and then you sort of write another fiction, which is the description of the book. I haven't quite got my description down yet. It's those three people, I suppose, and those three ways of looking at the world.
And then you write another fiction, which is how the book began.
Yeah.
And then you say it enough times so that you actually come to believe that's how.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's you know, it breaks some kind of voodoo for me to actually go back into my files and see what the first words were, because that's kind of terrifying. If you knew what the first words were, what you were embarking upon, it could spook you, and you might never write again. No.
Well, I always kind of make up some story, like I saw something on the subway, or
Yes.
a friend told me a story, and then, as I said, by the time I've said it enough times, I begin to believe that that's how the book began.
So I do sort of believe this story, however, which was that my last book, Actress, came out in 2020, March 2020, which, as you remember, was a terrible time for the planet. And my American tour for that book was interrupted by that amazing week when the world fell apart. I got a plane back home, and it was like a bird flying into a window pane. I had, it was just astonishing. So in the weeks and months after that, I was doing my daily mental health activities, plodding up out into the fresh air. And that spring was so amazing and so moving. I was utterly taken by the natural world and the rising spring, and the fact that the world was in a state of chaos around it. And I was reading poetry. I was reading poetry in Irish, in Old Irish and medieval Irish. And I don't know why that was where I went. I think prose was not possible. The readership had disappeared. The bookshops had shut. It was all gone. And what I reached for were very ancient forms of Irish poetry. And that meant something to me. It was like these were kind of sacred texts or something. And in the book I was reading were two little poems about dead birds. One, The Yellow Bittern, which is quite a famous poem about a bird that dies of thirst, and the other about a lady's pet blackbird that died. And the poets were mourning these tiny deaths in the 9th century and the 18th century. I just was pierced by it. I thought it was astonishing when death was so general and everywhere. So that's kind of one kind of atmosphere that the book was born in. But really, I started with Carmel, this tough-minded woman who had suffered a terrible rupture in her life, which was, the leaving of her father. So I had the poetry, I had Carmel, and that was pretty much what it was like in those days. We were tough-minded. We were keeping it all going. And then about a year into the writing, Carmel was too literal. I couldn't bring her anywhere. And then I decided I'd get her pregnant, which was more fun than you'd think.
more fun than she has in the process, probably.
Indeed, sadly so. Yeah. Well noted. Well noted.
There are poems in the book, and I'm going to ask you to read one in a moment. But had you written poetry before?
I don't think so. Not really. Do you know what I mean? I wrote some bad poetry in my adolescence, and I wrote love poetry, and I did actually write in Irish. Now that I think about it, which is a strange thing for a child of my generation to be doing, but it's nonetheless true. I had some. I mean, the thing that I like about Phil, although he's, more or less a commoner garden, well, he's not a bastard. Yeah, anyway, he's not a good guy, but I love the way that he is reaching for something. And I do understand that sense of reach when he writes,
It's very intimidating. Like you, the last poem I wrote, I think, was in high school. And I've been afraid. I mean, also
terrifying.
Terrifying. And once you know a lot of poets and hear how snooty they are about other poets, it makes it even more frightening.
Oh, no, they only like other poets who are dead. I mean, really long dead, They might allow another poet to be okay in some regard, but they are the toughest crowd. And if you think American poets are hard, I'd say Irish poets are harder still, because they're high level. I mean, there are also some of them are extraordinarily nice people. So I shouldn't be slagging them off. I shouldn't be laughing at them. Their inner poet, though, is really an astringent presence, I think.
Yeah, no, they're very nice, unless you happen to be another poet, in which case.
Okay.
So, do you want to read?
I think they are the worst.
They're the worst.
They are the worst.
They are the worst. And also, in some ways, I mean, when I used to teach at writers' conferences and so forth, I would envy poets because they had such an easy job compared. They could read the poem that was being discussed on the way to the class, whereas we had to spend, hours and hours reading.
I know, brevity is great, isn't it?
It is great.
Yeah.
So do you want to read one of the poems?
I will. I'll read that one that I mentioned, The Yellow Bittern. I'll see if I've got the dates right. The Yellow Bittern is a very famous Irish poem. It's been translated a number of times by different poets, and it was entirely cheeky of me to take it on. So it's one of the many birds in the book, and it's translated from An Bunán Bui in the Irish of Cahal Bui Magilligana, 1679 to 1756. Oh, yellow bittern, my heart is with your feathers in the field. Your wings your wings scattered like great Hector's unburied bones. You did no harm. In a damp country, it was thirst that killed you. A key turned in the weather, and the lake was shut in ice. If you had but called me, I would have broken it so you could wet your beak, great-hearted drinker, my friend. The rest of them I do not mourn, the cuckoo, the wren, the grey heron. But the bittern honk across the marshes was my own mournful, boozing cry. My wife says it will be the death of me, and I say, look at that poor bastard of a bird, killed with the thirst. Put ice in your gin, my friends, and slug it down. The afterlife is one long Good Friday with the pubs not open. Drink while you have a mouth on you. So that's a version, it's more or less what the poet says. More or less the same kind of lines, and the Hector reference, the Trojan War reference, very typical of that. Very typical of Phil to be writing about ditches and hedgerows and see Achilles there, see the gods in the hedgerows. That kind of nobility, that kind of stuff. Fun.
And the alcohol reference, of course.
Yeah, the birds and the alcohol reference. It is a drinking poem. Yeah. Yeah.
So as I was reading the book, I kind of formed this idea about Irish literature, which you can probably tell me is completely ridiculous. But it occurred to me that that male Irish writers are the most romantic of writers. I mean, Joyce, of course, and Yeats and Kevin Barry. I mean, when I read Nightboat to Tangier, I thought, well, that's the most romantic book I've ever read. And even the Anglo-Irish, I mean, William Trevor and so forth. But Irish women writers are among the least romantic of writers. When you think about, Edna O'Brien and Anna Burns and you and Emma McBride, I mean, almost anti-romantic.
Certainly in Anna Burns and Emma McBride's terms, yeah. I suppose the early Edna O'Brien was romantic in a funny kind of way. But yeah, no wedding dresses or no bluebells there. Very little natural world, even the one set in the country. Yeah, that's a very good observation, and I wonder why.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you.
Well, there are good storylines to be kind of about male idealism, for example. That used to be an old storyline about a man going out and doing something idealistic rather than staying at home and feeding his children. So that kind of high-mindedness versus the kind of practicalities of rearing a family. I mean, women don't. People are always surprised when you write tough female characters as though women weren't tough. And actually, women can't be anything else. They don't have another option because so much of the practical care of the world is on their shoulders. You can't manage that without being a little bit pragmatic. Yeah,
the book is it's kind of short on romantic love. And in fact, I thought this is I've hardly ever read a book with so much alienated sex or bad sex in it. And it's
I'm sorry about that, Francine.
No, I get it completely, because it's so much easier to write about bad sex than good sex, since the language of good sex is co-opted by pornography, whereas bad sex, porn pretends it doesn't exist. But the men, I mean, Nell's father.
There's also disappointing sex.
Disappointing sex, yeah.
Yeah.
And Nell's father might as well be a sperm donor for all the importance he has in the lives of the characters. I mean, he's just,
Well, Carmel's father left her, and she decided she wasn't going to have a father for her child. If she ever had a child, she wouldn't, involve the father, because that would just be like, she says, holding the baby out and dropping it on the concrete. They can't be trusted. She wasn't going to do what had been done to her. She wasn't going to allow it to happen to any child of her own. So when she has the child, she's a single mother, and it's just the pair of them. They're just one-on-one, basically, face-to-face, that very dyadic kind of mother-daughter relationship, which no father to triangulate or intervene, Yeah. So yes, I suppose there is some good sex at the end.
Finally, right?
Yeah, I had been accused in the past of writing bad sex, and I wanted to say, no, it is, the sex is really good. It's just with the wrong person.
It can happen. It
So,
can happen.
yeah, I mean, you do make these distinctions, which are now more and more available to be written between how people feel and what their bodies do, and what the context is. These are all different kinds of, you know.
Yeah.
There's very little. There's very little theater of sex, if you know what I mean. So although Nell gets into an abusive relationship, I was very careful not to shade it into kink or into BDSM. It's not ritualized. It's all kind of murky and that to me was the best way to keep it, actually.
And alienated. I mean, it's the
Carmel is dissociated.
Yeah.
Carmel is dissociated. Nell, not so much. Yeah. I mean, these terms, you know, alienated, dissociated, how embodied are we at various times? These are all just, to me, fantastically interesting questions.
Yeah.
And so you don't do it with one kind of simple broad stroke of love, you know, not disconnected. You know, there are many. There's a kind of push me pull you at play. There's quite a lot of both. You know, there's a lot of interest and texture in those exchanges for me, or I hope there are anyway.
One of the things I loved about the book and your writing in general is how honest it is about things that people don't talk about. I mean, now no one talks about anything. I mean, there's so many things that people don't talk about. And one of those things in the book was, even though the men are sort of tangential to what's going on, I mean, the father, grandfather, husband is absent and still exerts a huge effect. But there's a kind of an amazing section where Carmel has a lover, I guess you could call Ronan, and she realizes that she and her daughter, she and Nell, are kind of in competition for his attention. And I thought, well, even that's so interesting, because even though the men are in some ways secondary to everything that's going on, there's a way in which women do compete, even within a family. I mean, I can remember in the last years of my own mother's life, who was a wonderful mother, but I do remember thinking that she kind of would have liked me to just be out of the picture so she could hang out with my husband, you know.
Yeah, you know, I know those mothers. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, my mother would say, don't. Make sure he has some cake, you know what I mean? That they, you know, sit them down on the sofa and treat them really well and enjoy them. And yeah, and that actually is a theme through the book for various women, that they just have to see a man and it cheers them up, you know, especially if they're tall. One of them, Carmel prefers men. She finds them more simple. It's like the many ways they turn towards some male presence with relief. There you are.
Yeah.
Thank God, at last, you know.
I mean, there's an astonishing scene where Nell sings and she's still a girl, sings a kind of slightly, or maybe not so slightly, seductive version of Santa Baby.
A little bit, a tiny bit. Yeah, no, she turns into another creature. She's 9, and her mother looks at her and says she's regressed to like a 5-year-old. She's so infantile in her flirtatiousness with this person she only unconsciously recognizes as part of her life. And she's regressed to a child that Carmel doesn't recognize, as though she started all over again. She started a new version of herself now that she has Ronan to flirt with. Yeah. These are just observations. I'm glad you, of course, your good eye, you pick them up. I'm not making any larger point. I think it's just that kind of world that they're in, maybe. Yeah.
Well, no, I think it's in. I mean, it's one of those things that you notice in real life, but I can't remember ever having seen in a book before. I mean, yes. I mean,
Excuse me, sorry.
Victorian novels are just full of female competition for men, but it's not the same. It's not the same as A Mother and a Child, which was very startling and very recognizable and kind of brave and true, I thought.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yeah, no, I mean, because it's the first time that Nell has a man to practice on, put it that way. So, I mean, that was back in the bad old days. There would be quite a lot of flirtation with friends' fathers. I don't know if that was in your youth.
Yeah.
Go to a friend's house and the father would be sort of winding you up and getting a bit of fun out of you. And it was flirtatious, and they were clearly there for practice. And I'm sure, it wasn't in any way but good, but it seemed very benign at the time.
Yeah, well, the friend looked on appalled.
Yeah, like, what's my daddy doing?
Right, yeah.
Like, what's that?
Or why are you so eager to drive the babysitter home moments?
Well, that's the less benign iteration of it. In my life, I was fortunate that it stayed benign, but it was very definitely and recognizable manners of the day.
Yeah. The other thing that interests me so much was the idea of influence from beyond the grave. I mean, the way the grandfather's poetry and presence and way of living exerted such an enormous influence on the granddaughter with all those years in between and his absence in between. I mean, he'd gone and married somebody else and so on and so on. So what about that? I mean, do you think, I don't know, how often does that happen, or how does that happen? Or you must have been thinking about that as you wrote it.
So, I mean, there are various kinds of remnant here. There are various kinds of ghosts. Like the poems are remnants. They're the remnants of the man. They're a kind of shedding of some description. And his writings are remnants. And then there's another kind of remnant, which is his image on YouTube. He turns up late, in a kind of college. I think it was actually a college interview, very serious minded, very male, very nodding. And so that remnant has that kind of is a different kind of shedding as well, which interests me a lot. So these aren't ghosts. They're kind of, I kind of think it's like thinner than a mask.
Uh-huh.
It's just like a kind of version, that just kind of crystallizes and is there, a version that's there online in the poems, just there for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, watching the interview on YouTube was an extraordinary scene, and electronics are very present throughout the book. I mean, people are texting and emailing and so forth, and it made me think about issues of, well, speaking of influence, and also issues of mortality and immortality and influence, because once, as we all know, once something is out there on the internet, it never goes away. It's always there. So his presence, in a way, has a kind of permanence to it that it wouldn't have if it were just words on the page.
So yeah, he's an electronic ghost. I mean, and it is quite ghostly and it's quite uncanny, I suppose. There is also his genetic inheritance that Nell, when she sees him online, he opens his mouth and her entire family comes out of it. So he has some kind of way of emphasizing one word, a kind of smile he has. He has her mother's way of sitting forward and being kind of punchy about what she's saying. And they're all there. It's like the whole family is there from the outset in this persona. And she feels that his presence is she says, a fat rope of DNA filled with blood. I like that idea of a twisted rope, Anyway, there's a lot of spirals in the book. And yeah, so there's the genetic inheritance of who she's like, apart from anything else. She's like Phil. She says things that Phil has said in the past, and they surprise her when they echo through her own, when she hears him say, a poet is just somebody walking the road. And she's already said, all I want to do is walk out and sleep under a hedge. and wake in the, wake in the rain. I just want to be completely free and unencumbered. So they're quite similar in many ways. And Nell also kind of breaks into poetic speak by accident, almost without intention.
And she's looking for that connection. I mean, all the way through.
She is, yeah. Well, she doesn't know she's looking for a fake connection. When she's fighting with her mother, which during her teenage years is frequently, she says she curls up with Phil and to sweeten the hurt. So she reads the poems as though they're sincere, and not only, well, of course they're sincere, as though they're authentic to the life as well as to the mind of the man, or to some greater kind of presence. And of course, they're not really authentic to that, because he was a bit, because he didn't know himself properly.
And then there's the tattoo.
So yeah, she gets a tattoo of one of his lines and puts it on her skin. I was really reluctant about that. I was like, oh God, I can't do that. But it fit.
Oh, it completely fit. It completely fit. Mm. And then I can't remember, she's considering getting another one, or she gets another one, or
she gets a little Wren on her on this part, that indescribable part of the body that I had some work trying to describe the space there. Where sometimes people get a little bluebird, she gets a Wren, little Irish Wren, tiny.
So I've always thought that our real subject as fiction writers is consciousness. And that everything else, I mean, plot and story and dialogue are just kind of a frame on which we hang, that we use to convey consciousness. And I was very aware of that reading the book, because we're so deeply into the consciousness of these women. I mean, we can hear, their thought patterns are so, it feels almost, I mean, I'm sure nothing could be further from the truth, but it feels almost, not stream of consciousness so much, but it's kind of unedited transcription of their consciousness.
Yeah, good. There was an amount of editing that went into all that. I think when you say consciousness, I would say language, and they're not. They're almost the same thing in some ways, because Nell is quite interested in the way that people are different in the way they think, in the way they see the world, and that this makes this difference between people means that it's difficult to connect. You have to translate yourself for somebody else's understanding, rather than that kind of wonderful merging and sense of union you get from being and feeling yourself to be in love, so that kind of realization that the other people aren't telepathic is kind of, a surprise to Nell. But her language, which is kind of very modern, very, very present tense, her cadences are short. This is the way she thinks. And she's got this very eclectic mind. She has big wonderings and big opinion. Well, not so many opinions, because that can get tedious, although somebody of her age would probably have more opinions, but I kept it to her large thoughts about life and the world, and to this amazing gathering she does, picking up stuff from the internet and weaving it into her own life and difficulties. So that's the way she is. That's Nell, and when you find that's what, isn't it what everyone says, finding the voice? But when you find that mode, then you can write all day. It's kind of you know her once you have that timbre and that cadence and that sense of duration. She doesn't write long. She's a young woman of the modern age. Carmel then is in third person past tense. Because she knows things. That she comes from a kind of literary tradition where things can be known, and it's much more naturalistic fiction, which makes me wonder, because Carmel is very literal minded and she closes herself down a lot. She resists insight. She doesn't indulge her imagination. It's kind of a luxury, like poetry is a luxury. And so you kind of think, well, what were all those naturalistic novels? Why did I not feel those characters to be limited? Because put against the style of Nell, she does feel kind of more constructed, self-constructed, more solid and more limited. Then Phil has a kind of blarney.
Now there is that chapter from his point of view where you suddenly get all that way of thinking about himself and his life and his work and his blarney, I guess. Yeah, also, I mean, Carmel is much more of a survivor. She has to be. And
Sure.
Nell, in a way, because of her generation or her upbringing or so forth, has the liberty to have that kind of more freewheeling consciousness than
Sure.
her mother.
Yeah, no, it's a luxury. It is for sure a luxury. And although I find Carmel hard to write, people identify with her quite easily. And you know, I mean, she loves Nell absolutely, and and that love is finally kind of tragic. She doesn't, sadly, she doesn't think of herself as a good mother. So I want the reader to kind of pull back from the page and start arguing with my characters and say, no, 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 don't do that, Nell. Don't go out with that guy. Don't do that, Carmel. Be nice now. I want them to kind of push against what's going on, like, you know, like in a horror story where you say, don't go into the room. No, don't go into the room.
Right. The call is coming from inside the house. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, he's on the extension. That's actually one line.
Yeah, you do. I mean, the idea of what's a good mother or what's not a good mother runs all the way through the novel. I mean, more and more I hear people talking about a good enough mother. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I did think
It's
about
a phrase from Winnicott. It's a phrase from the British
right?
psychologist Donald Winnicott, yeah, which is a good enough mother, which, you know, came at a moment in the history of psychology that let women off the hook, because while he was writing, there were other people writing saying that the mothers of schizophrenics were refrigerator mothers.
Oh, right, autism. We cause autism
and all the things that mothers cause was everything. That was all the things we cause. There was no limit. It's a kind of megalomania too, isn't it? It's kind of satisfying. You know, I did all of that. It's like,
well, also the fact that the men have such minimal input in the novel would make it seem, you know, more like, I mean, questions of blame and responsibility would come up more strongly.
Also have quite a limited input in that psychological discourse that we were just talking about. So it's not seen as a problem if the father is awful in a kind of more or less ordinary way, because that is nothing better is expected of fathers.
It's right, very limited.
I mean, in that kind of mode of psychological thinking.
There's also another startling moment where Ronan becomes ill, and Carmel doesn't feel that it's her responsibility to hang around and take care of him just because she slept with him a couple of times. And I thought, how extraordinary, and how, again, anti-romantic. I mean, the romantic.
Surely, yes. No, she slept with him for 5 months, actually.
Yeah.
And the nurse says, you know, your name is on the form, basically, next of kin. And she said, what? I mean, is that what happens when you sleep with someone? She can't join up those dots at all. But actually, and I was so involved in deconstructing this idea of female care and really enjoying it, saying, if you just fall asleep beside a guy, do you have to look after him too? You shouldn't fall asleep on the bus. Maybe don't fall asleep on the bus. So if you wake up, you're going to have to look after some guy and do his washing up. So I was on a little riff about all of this, and I didn't notice that Carmel was doing what her father had done until my husband pointed it out. He said, no, she's just doing what Phil did. She's leaving somebody who isn't well. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know.
It never occurred to me, actually.
Okay.
because she's not leaving someone with whom she has 2 children. She's just leaving.
No, she's just leaving. She's just not going to do that. Yeah, it's not what she's for. And when she's leaving, she has this kind of roaring inside her, saying, I have a daughter to look after. So I can't be hanging around doing this. But actually, when Phil left, he had a similar kind of roaring, although it's not specified in the text. My poetry. I have to look after my poetry. There is some kind of sweetness that must be protected and nurtured that other people intrude on for both of them.
Yeah, it's quite different from the romantic view. I mean, I've been rereading Jane Eyre to teach this semester, and there it's like, oh, Mr. Rochester is blind. So much the better. I can take care of him, and he's been defanged in every way. But that's certainly not Carmel or Nell. And I was kind of cheering for them, actually, at that point.
Oh, good. That's also good. Yeah.
So do you want to read a little more, and then maybe we'll go?
Okay, yeah.
Questions.
So I will read the bit we referenced about finding a little piece on YouTube online. I don't think I specified YouTube. And this is Carmel, who's in her 50s when she finds this piece of her father online. On the table, the silent computer stayed coyly closed, tight-lipped. Phil, her meaty father, he's a great carnivore, was saying nothing. Lamb chop, pork chop, chop, chop. The smell of his breath must have been terrible, though she never noticed it when she clambered up into his lap to put her fingers in his mouth and pull and let the gum spring back. Flop, flop. The interview was recorded in America. It must have been 1982 or 1983 when Phil was teaching there. A television studio, cavernously dark. In the center of it, a pair of microphone stands crisscrossed. At either end of this gleaming crux, two men who looked older than they might have done talked to each other from tan leather swivel chairs. Carmel tapped the spacebar and let them go. The men's voices were conversational and clear, but the words came from behind some faint scrim of sound, and she ramped the volume up to check what it might be. There was the white hiss of electronic decay, and beyond that again the shadows of other voices, as though some older recording were breaking through. Or the tape had magnetized itself on the spool somehow, and the men's words were overlaid by their own future words from further down the road. This acoustic bleed was one indicator of the era. The other was the way her father smoked throughout, leaning forward to dab at a fat crystal ashtray on a coffee table of glass and chrome. Phil's tie was not straight. His jacket was the usual disgrace. He twisted forward, jerked back. He hunched over in the chair and pushed the tweed away to scratch at a spot on his ribs. There he was, 8 long years after the whipped off sheet and the broken chair. Dado. There he was.
There he was. Beautiful. So is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that we haven't brought up, or something?
It's a very modernist kind of bit about the voices on the roll and the spool and all that. And when people ask me how I wrote Nell because she's so young, as though I had never been young, it's like as though youth was a different country. And actually young people are the worst for that, because a feeling of not being understood is part of being young, I think, in some ways. And they're quite territorial about it. I said, I remember, I mean, my answer is that I went back to my early short stories, which had quite a modernist impulse, and were very interested in the machine and in women, the organic female body and the kind of machine, whatever the machine was, escalators, walkways, the internet, tapes, all those kind of things. So Nell is all of that as well. It's been, I hope, a little bit funny.
And completely convincing.
Good.
Thank you so much. Eric, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes. But first, I must say thank you to you both. This is such a riveting conversation. At last, we know that great novelists make up their origin stories and what they really think of poets. So among
I'm in a lot of trouble already, Eric. I don't want to make it any worse.
Well, it's out there now. But you know, I want to start with a question that I've received more in my emails over the past couple of weeks than I've probably any other. It struck me how often it was repeated, and it's something I think we've all heard before or thought before. I don't know if you'll have an answer. I certainly don't. But as people were expressing their excitement about this event, they kept saying different versions of the question, why is it that Irish writers have this uncanny command of the English novel? But what explains this? So I throw it out to you.
Yeah, well, you know, success breeds success, I suppose. That's one way of looking at it. There is, I even look at the young ones coming up and the level of engagement with both with language and with life. I mean, it's those two things. It's not just one, or it's not language becoming sort of wonderful and nonsensical. It really hangs on to feeling and to, yeah. I mean, also, I kind of think that all the Irish writers are different, although you might hear them in the same accent, that they're really, truly different from voice to voice, and they have different kind of artistic concerns. But when I tell my own kind of life story and how much the library was, how important the library was, how much reading there was around the place, I realize that it is kind of distinctive and that it continues. There are various factors, free education, a big interest in education, a respect for the book, and success. I mean, if I look at a young woman writing now, I realize that, when I say won the Booker Prize in 2007, so-and-so might have been 16, and the first thing that they think is, oh, when I grow up now, I'm going to do that. It's only 10 years before they grow up, and they're doing exactly that.
Right. Oh, yeah. Here people, well, they used to want to grow up to be president. It'd be much better aspiration to grow up to want to win the Booker. So I want to, maybe this alludes to poetry a little bit, and there's probably doctoral dissertations at this point on repetition in your work, but I feel you're doubling down in this book, even in the passage you read, and even in the title here, the Wren. It's certainly a hallmark of your style.
Do you find it so? Because I mean, you could. I don't know, but I'd say I'd point to The End of the Dead by James Joyce, the short stories in which the snow falling, softly falling out, gently falling, when he repeats and varies the word falling throughout a paragraph. That would be bad writing, were it not James Joyce. And that actually goes back to the bardic poetry and the syllabics that they're using in the 18th century that are also somewhere here in this book. But I hope I don't do it too much. If you point it out to me, I'll get cross with myself, and I'll be taking them out,
Oh, don't do that. No, they're too.
I took out 100 iterations of the word little. Oh my God, the things your style after 30 years at the desk, and you don't even realize these very basic little follies that a little rhythm, a little this and a little that. Oh my God.
Right.
I did a word search and cried.
Right.
Oh, it's horrifying when that happens. I read a little travel book about Sicily, and I decided to search and remove the word beautiful, and the book lost 5 pages.
Oh God. 5 pages?
Yeah, it was extreme and depressing.
Oh God. I actually also do a search on colors and on words like crying, weeping, lamenting, and laughing. I tried to, just for my own kind of interest, and if there's too much, I might lighten it or weight it a little, one way or the other.
Sure. Francine, I want you to chime in on this too, because I'm reflecting now on how so many of your reviews and your writings about fiction have been instructive to me. And we were speaking earlier about Anne's recent review of Joanne Beard. So for both of you, writing about other writers, how does that play into your work? Does it feed your work? Is it a community activism sort of thing? What role does it play in your life as a writer?
It's a very good question. Maybe Francine wants to answer it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm always recommending books to friends. I'm always saying, oh, you just have to read this immediately. So just to me, reviewing is just a kind of more public way of doing that. I mean, when I was younger, I took a certain pleasure in just trashing books that I didn't like. I mean, I don't know. I somehow felt that they were insulting to the, but I won't do that anymore. It's not worth it. But
I don't read them if I don't like them, more or less, So, I mean, there are various ways you can maybe sneakily get a PDF before you agree to review. So you can at least know that you're not going to be, because there have been times where you walk into a book thinking, all the rest, I love the rest of this person's work. And you go, oh no, oh no. And that's really hard. I mean,
It's really
hard. Yeah. But so I generally review positively because I'm a writer rather than a critic. And I don't believe in ruining somebody's day. It's just, why would I? And I'm not in charge of a book. I'm more or less recommending it more than anything else. So I'm a kind of positive reviewer and no good. And I stand by that because there are plenty of different types of reviewers. So it's a kind of editorial decision more than anything else. But I like getting into what it is. The mechanism is kind of, that's nice. And seeing the kind of slant of light in a book. I mean, the Joanne Beards that I reviewed recently, Cherie, I reviewed in The Guardian, and it slowly seemed to me to be more and more kind of Puritan text, that it was very American and it was very filled with a kind of grace and simplicity and these values that, you know, rising. And once I know that, then I feel a lot better. I say, okay.
Yeah, that review, I remember begins with something like, I had been reading Joanne Beard's work and I had to put it down because it was too good. And I was like, oh yeah, any reader has felt that moment. Say more about that experience, because it is inexplicable and wonderful.
So that happened in Boston, in the bookshop in Brookline, I think, in Boston, and I picked up this book. And I mean, there are books where you say, oh, no, that's too good, and I'm not doing that now, thank you very much. I don't have the bandwidth, is the new phrase. I don't have the bandwidth for that right now. But actually, I put it down because it was so frightening. There was a man in a fire on the 5th floor of an apartment block, and I didn't know whether he was going to get out of that or not. And I thought, this isn't fair. It isn't fair on me in the middle of my afternoon here in a bookshop to make, you know, that I don't know what's going to happen to such a degree that I don't know what category writing this is. Because if I knew what the category was, then I know what the outcome is, and I know he was going to be all right. So I said, no, I put it down and walked away.
Someone is asking about the...
And came back to it 10 years later, and it's wonderful. Yeah.
But scary, but quite scary.
Terrifying.
Someone's asking about the thing about the TV interview that you had referenced in that passage, about technology in general. How do you see technology, either in this book or another? How do you bring that into to the dynamic of, in this case, the family you're writing about?
Well, actually, it was you, Eric, who chose that passage, and I was really kind of intrigued because I spent so long. I mean, I spent months on that damn scene, and as I was doing this over and over again, I was finding out what the book was or what Carmel was. It was a real key moment in the writing for me. It's like, oh, okay. So I'm glad that it came across as something interesting. What's the question? What is it about technology? Yeah. So that's 1983, and it's a certain kind of, I worked in TV, and it's a certain kind of archive tape. I think it might be a 1-inch studio tape or something, magnetic, and that happened with that. You don't really find it on YouTube as much as that. It's nice though, isn't it? It's nice that the voices are going from one tape to another. That's bleeding across. I don't know what it is about my characters and technology. I mean, we live in a technological world, and I do know that I write women who are made of flesh and blood in spaces that are mechanized or abstracted, and that seems to work for me.
Yeah.
Supermarkets are surprisingly modernist space. So my question is, if Kafka was a woman, what would happen? You send him off to the supermarket. What would happen? What would he write?
What would he buy?
Yeah.
What would he
Well,
buy?
he not only was he a vegetarian, but he had to chew every morsel 40
Yeah.
times, Fletcherize it or whatever that was. So that would kind of slow down your supermarket experience, I would imagine, or determine
Yeah.
it.
It's a good good area, isn't it? We could send them all off. We could send them all off without a
In the
list.
supermarket, yeah.
Ernest Hemingway, you have 5 children and a Thanksgiving dinner, which must be cooked before 3 o'clock tomorrow.
Oh,
Yeah.
boy.
Remember Bush went into a supermarket and the Bing.
He didn't know how much anything.
He didn't know what a scanner was. He didn't know that. He said, "Oh, that's really clever."
Yeah.
He hadn't seen any groceries scanned.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, that's not a very literary answer, but it could yield.
Oh no, the less literary, the better. Before the last question or two, just a reminder to the audience: you can grab a copy of The Wren, and Other Books by Anne Enright and Francine Prose at our bookseller link. I've read most of their books myself and highly recommend them all. And in the author's note in this book, you say something like about how poets can go gloriously wrong, and I thought that was a great turn of phrase. So just to circle back to that theme, what it sounds like you have some experience of that, but how is it that
Did I say this in my author's note that poems can go?
Poets can go gloriously wrong.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah.
Not that I disagree, but I found it such a fascinating observation. Wondered if you could unpack it. Yeah.
I don't recall it. It's like I've said too much in my life, and then if I so, that poetry can go gloriously wrong. Well, because
poets.
poets.
Yeah.
So this kind of feeds into the idea of our investment in the figure of the artist as though that meant something,
Mm-hmm.
So we're very disappointed, and the questioning of how much goes into the work of their kind of lack of self-awareness or their poor behavior or yada yada. So yes.
Yeah, it does, and also into Francine's observation about romanticism in the genders, because it seems that that vision of the artist is there's the risk of being too romantic about.
Well, so when a man is lyrical, that's a great luxury, and it carries some kind of. When a woman is lyrical in the same space, we would call her fey. We would say, "Why are you drifting off like that?" Perhaps.
And people are interested in your process, of course. In this case, revision. Your reference to working on that scene for months. What changes in revision for you as you write?
See, I don't really write. I just sit with the book for 3 months, 3 years. Actually, I was going to say, but 3. Yeah, I just work. I don't have a big plan. Maybe a year in, I'm very comfortable now with the uncertainty of all that, and I've made in the past structures that then I've had to remake as the book made its own way without my plans. So I'm much more relaxed about letting the book do its own thing. But one of the ways in getting the book to do its own thing is to pay really close attention to what you have already written, what the gestures are, when you recognize something on the page as being right, what that rightness is. So that's why I spent a very long time on that scene. So because once I could get that to its best version, I would know what I was writing.
Mm.
So it's not revising in a technical sense, it's a kind of sinking in to the character and to the possibilities of the character within those kinds of cadences and interests and all the rest of it. There's Carmel looking at this thing. What's that about? What's that about? And I think if I get the sentences right, I'll know more.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, as a reader, I'm grateful for your immersion, and grateful to you both for this amazing conversation. And thanks to our audience out there as well watching. I just want to remind everyone that in our region, that Rain Taxi's Twin Cities Book Festival is back in person at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds next month. We'll put a link in the chat for more info. If you're not in the area, don't forget to consider becoming a Rain Taxi member and receiving our quarterly Leica magazine, because it's like a book festival in your mailbox. Thanks again to you both. Thanks everyone for joining us. And wherever you are, happy reading.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the